In 1992, construction workers building a freeway in San Diego hit something that would take 25 years, a team of world-class scientists, and a bombshell paper in the world's most prestigious science journal to explain. What they found buried in that dirt shouldn't exist. If it's real, everything you were taught about how humans got to America is wrong. Not by a few thousand years, but by over 100,000. It started as a routine job. Every time California builds a new highway or widens an old one, the law requires paleontologists to walk the site first, just in case heavy machinery is about to grind up something ancient and irreplaceable. It is not glamorous work. Most of the time it means logging a few broken shells, some scattered animal bones, nothing that stops the bulldozers for more than an afternoon. Nobody expected the freeway expansion project near San Diego to be any different. The California Department of Transportation had hired the San Diego Natural History Museum to monitor the excavation, and a field paleontologist named Richard Cerutti was assigned to watch the dirt as it came up. Then Cerutti spotted something that did not look like ordinary fossil debris. Bones, big ones, tusks, molars, and they were not scattered randomly the way you would expect from an animal that simply died and decomposed over thousands of years. They were broken in strange, sharp ways, and they were sitting right next to large stones that looked oddly out of place, as if they had been positioned rather than deposited by chance. Cerutti called in the rest of the museum's paleontology team, and what followed was 5 months of careful excavation, inch by inch, layer by layer, while the freeway construction paused around them. By the time they were done, they had recovered the remains of a single mastodon, a huge extinct relative of the elephant that once roamed North America. There were tusks, molars, ribs, vertebrae, limb bones, and more than 300 bone fragments in total. And scattered among those bones were 5 large stones, cobbles really, the kind of rocks you could hold comfortably in 2 hands, that appeared to have been used as hammers and anvils. At first glance, this might not sound like the discovery of the century. Broken mastodon bones and some rocks. Paleontologists find mammoth and mastodon remains across North America fairly often. But the more Cerutti's team looked at the pattern of breakage, the stranger it became. Fresh bone, the kind that has not yet dried out or fossilized, breaks in a very particular way when it is struck with force. It shatters into curved, spiral fractures, the same way a stick of green wood snaps differently than a dry, brittle one. And that is exactly what they were seeing on several of the mastodon's limb bones. Not the jagged, weathered breaks you would expect from trampling, erosion, or scavenging animals gnawing at the carcass over time, but the clean, spiral fractures associated with something striking fresh, still-living bone with significant force shortly after death. Put those 2 things together, fresh spiral fractured bone and stones, bearing use marks resting in direct association with that bone, and you have a pattern that experienced archaeologists recognize instantly. It is the signature of someone processing a carcass. Breaking open long bones is not random destruction. It is purposeful. Marrow, the soft fatty tissue inside a large mammal's limb bones, was an extraordinarily valuable source of calories and fat for early humans, especially in lean seasons when other food was scarce. Cracking open a femur to get at the marrow inside is one of the oldest and most universal behaviors in the human story, documented at sites going back well over 1 million years on other continents. So when Cerutti's team saw this pattern in San Diego, the implication seemed obvious. Someone had come across this mastodon, or perhaps even hunted it, and had broken its bones open to get at the marrow and possibly to make tools from the sharp fragments. There was just one problem, and it was a big one. Nobody yet knew how old any of this was. Dating a site like this is not simple. The most famous method, radiocarbon dating, only works on organic material that still contains a measurable amount of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope that decays at a known rate. But radiocarbon dating has a hard ceiling. Past roughly 50,000 years, there is so little carbon-14 left in a sample that the method becomes useless. And it turned out the mastodon bones from this site did not have enough collagen preserved to run a reliable radiocarbon test anyway. The organic protein that carbon dating depends on had broken down too much over time. So the team turned to other methods. Their first attempt used a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures how long ago mineral grains in the surrounding sediment were last exposed to sunlight. That initial estimate suggested the site might be somewhere between 60 and 70,000 years old, already an eye-popping number, more than 3 times older than the generally accepted arrival of humans in the Americas. But the team was not satisfied that this method alone was precise enough for a claim this extraordinary. So they pursued a second independent dating technique to see if it would confirm or contradict the first. That second method was uranium series dating, sometimes called uranium-thorium dating. It works because bone, as it sits buried in the ground, slowly absorbs uranium from the surrounding groundwater. Uranium is radioactive and decays into thorium at a known, steady rate. By carefully measuring the ratio of uranium to thorium locked inside the bone and accounting for the way uranium can migrate in and out of bone over long periods, scientists can calculate how long that bone has been in the ground. It is a method more commonly used to date much older material, like the calcite formations in caves, but it can be applied to fossil bone as well, and it does not have the same 50,000-year ceiling that radiocarbon dating does. The team sent samples out for uranium series analysis, run by a specialist at the United States Geological Survey. And the results came back consistent, not once, but across multiple samples taken from different bones at the site. The number that kept appearing was approximately 130,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment, because this is the number that turned a quiet paleontology project into one of the most explosive claims in the history of American archaeology. 130,000 years is not just old. It is almost incomprehensibly older than anything else ever proposed for human presence in the Americas. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story of how humans reached this continent went something like this. Toward the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough to expose a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, small groups of hunter-gatherers crossed over from Asia and gradually spread southward. For decades, the oldest widely accepted evidence for this migration pointed to a culture called Clovis, dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, named after distinctive stone spear points, first found near Clovis, New Mexico. Even as newer discoveries push that date back further, to sites suggesting people were present around 15,000, maybe 20,000 years ago, the broad consensus among archaeologists held firm on one point. Humans had not been in the Americas for anything remotely close to 100,000 years. A date of 130,000 years does not just nudge that timeline, it obliterates it. It would mean that whoever, or whatever, broke open those mastodon bones in San Diego was walking around North America roughly 115,000 years before the date most archaeologists were comfortable with. To put that gap in perspective, it is a span of time longer than the entire history of anatomically modern humans, existing as a distinct species in some estimates, and it edges into territory. That raises a deeply strange question. If this date is accurate, who actually made it to California 130,000 years ago? Because that is well before the standard model has Homo sapiens dispersing out of Africa in the numbers needed to eventually populate the entire globe. It even predates, or sits right at the edge of, when some other hominin species were still walking the earth, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans further east, and possibly other archaic human relatives whose fossils we have not yet found. This is exactly the problem the research team had to wrestle with. They were not claiming that modern humans, Homo sapiens like you and me, were definitely responsible. Because based on everything else we know from genetics and the fossil record, that would be almost impossible to square with the evidence from everywhere else in the world. Instead, the paper carefully left the identity of the toolmaker an open question, suggesting only that some member of the genus Homo, some early human relative, was responsible. It did not have to be our species. It could have been an entirely different, currently unidentified branch of the human family tree, one that somehow made its way across Asia and into North America tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone currently believes was possible, and left behind no other trace that we have found. That is an enormous claim resting on a single site. The team leading this research understood exactly how radical their conclusions sounded. The lead author on the study, museum paleontologist Tom Demarais, said publicly at the time that he recognized how old the date was and how dramatically it would revise the accepted timeline. He and his colleagues knew that a claim of this size demands an extraordinarily high burden of proof, and so before they ever submitted their findings, they spent years trying to rule out every alternative explanation they could think of. Could the bones simply have been broken naturally? Bones can fracture from all kinds of processes that have nothing to do with humans. Sediment compaction over thousands of years, trampling by other large animals, geological pressure, even heavy construction equipment disturbing the ground before the site was properly identified. The team argued against each of these possibilities using the physical evidence in front of them. They pointed out that scavenging carnivores, the kind that might gnaw on a mastodon carcass looking for marrow, simply do not have the jaw strength to break through the middle of a large, fresh limb bone the way these bones were broken. A hyena or a large cat can crack open the thinner ends of a bone, but the dense, thick shaft in the middle of a mastodon femur is a different story entirely. To test their hypothesis directly, the researchers ran an experiment that became one of the more memorable parts of the story. They obtained the bones of a recently deceased modern elephant, the mastodon's closest living relative, and struck them with stone hammers against stone anvils, trying to replicate the exact conditions they believed occurred at the ancient site. According to the team, the fracture patterns they produced in the elephant bones matched, almost exactly, the spiral fractures observed on the fossilized mastodon bones from San Diego. They also compared the Cerutti bones to fracture patterns documented at other, much younger and far less controversial North American sites, places where Mastodon remains dated to somewhere between 14,000 and 33,000 years ago, showed clear, undisputed evidence of human butchery. The fracture patterns at those confirmed sites, the team argued, looked remarkably similar to what they were seeing at Cerutti, just tens of thousands of years older. When the paper was finally published in April of 2017 in the journal Nature, one of the most respected and rigorously peer-reviewed scientific journals in the world, it did not slip quietly into the academic literature. It landed like an earthquake. News outlets around the world picked up the story within hours. Headlines announced that the history of humanity in the Americas might need to be completely rewritten. The San Diego Natural History Museum, which had quietly been running its own paleontology consulting operation for decades, suddenly found itself at the center of an international media storm, holding press conferences and fielding questions from journalists who wanted to know one simple thing. Were there really people, or people-like beings, wandering around California more than 100,000 years before anyone thought possible? But almost as quickly as the excitement spread, so did the skepticism. And this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because what happened next was the scientific process doing exactly what it's supposed to do when someone makes an enormous claim. Other archaeologists did not simply accept the conclusion because it appeared in a famous journal. They picked it apart. Within months, a group of prominent archaeologists published a formal critique in a journal called Paleo-America. Their objections were sharp and specific. First, they pointed out that no stone tools, no clearly manufactured artifacts had been found at the site. Everything the original team identified as a hammerstone or anvil was, in the critics' view, simply a naturally occurring rock that happened to be present. And interpreting ordinary rocks as tools based on wear patterns alone is notoriously difficult and subject to bias. Second, they raised the possibility that the fracture patterns, rather than being caused by deliberate human percussion, could have resulted from entirely natural processes. Heavy sediment settling and compacting over 130,000 years exerts tremendous pressure, and bones buried under that kind of long-term geological stress can crack and fracture in ways that might mimic the patterns produced by a hammer blow. Third, and perhaps most pointedly, some critics raised the uncomfortable possibility that modern disturbance was to blame. This was, after all, a site discovered during active freeway construction. Heavy machinery had been operating in the area before the paleontological team even arrived. Could a bulldozer or an excavator have caused some of this damage, either directly or by disturbing the sediment layers in ways that confused the interpretation of what belonged with what? The debate did not stay confined to a single round of critique and response. Over the following years, it turned into an ongoing exchange, almost a running argument conducted through the pages of academic journals. The original research team, led by Desmarais, along with paleontologist Stephen Holin and several colleagues, published formal replies defending their interpretation point by point. They argued that their years of fieldwork had already accounted for the possibility of construction disturbance, since the bones and stones were found well below any layer that showed evidence of modern digging, sitting undisturbed in their original geological context. They maintained that their experimental work, striking fresh elephant bone with stone hammers, produced fracture patterns, specific enough that natural sediment pressure alone could not adequately explain them. Then in 2019, a separate group of researchers took a different angle on the controversy. Rather than arguing about whether the bones were broken by humans or by natural forces, they focused specifically on the experimental methodology itself, the part of the study where the team struck elephant bones to try to replicate the ancient fracture patterns. Their critique argued that good experimental archaeology requires testing multiple, competing hypotheses under controlled conditions, not just demonstrating that one particular method can produce a similar-looking result. In other words, showing that hammerstones can create spiral fractures does not prove that only hammerstones can create spiral fractures. Until researchers systematically tested every plausible natural alternative under the same rigorous conditions and ruled each one out, the critics argued the human explanation remained one plausible hypothesis among several, not a proven conclusion. This back and forth has continued for years, and it is never fully resolved. Some archaeologists remain genuinely persuaded by the original evidence and consider it a serious, credible hypothesis that deserves further investigation rather than dismissal. Others remain firmly unconvinced, arguing that a claim this extraordinary, one that would rewrite the fundamental timeline of human migration into an entire hemisphere, simply cannot rest on a single site with no comparable evidence found anywhere else in North America. No other tools, and no directly associated human or hominin remains. Notably, no bones or fossils from the toolmakers themselves, whoever or whatever they were, have ever been recovered at the site. Everything hinges entirely on the indirect evidence of the mastodon bones and the stones found beside them. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how high the bar is in a case like this. In archaeology, there's a general understanding that claims for extremely early human presence on a continent need to meet several demanding standards before the broader scientific community will accept them. The evidence needs to come from a clearly defined, undisturbed geological layer, so there is no ambiguity about how old the material actually is. The dating itself needs to rely on reliable, ideally multiple independent methods that agree with one another. And crucially, the findings need to be supported by more than one line of evidence, and ideally, more than one site. A single location, however carefully excavated, is always going to face intense scrutiny because science generally distrusts conclusions that rest on one isolated data point, no matter how compelling that data point initially appears. This is part of what makes the Cerutti Mastodon site such a fascinating case study in how science actually works, as opposed to how it is often portrayed in dramatic headlines. It is tempting to frame this story as either total vindication, proof that everything we thought we knew about American prehistory is wrong, or as complete debunking, proof that the researchers made an obvious mistake that any careful scientist should have caught. The reality sitting between those two extremes is much less satisfying for headline writers, but far more representative of how genuine scientific uncertainty actually functions. The uranium dating appears technically sound, and multiple independent samples returned consistent results, which is not nothing. The fracture patterns are real, documented and photographed extensively, and the experimental comparisons to elephant bone were conducted by a team with genuine expertise in bone taphonomy. At the same time, the complete absence of any other confirmed evidence for humans in the Americas anywhere close to this age creates an enormous, almost impossible to ignore gap. If people, or hominins of any kind, were successfully living in California 130,000 years ago, why do we not find any other trace of them anywhere else on the continent for the next 100,000 years? Did they arrive and then die out completely, leaving absolutely no genetic trace in later populations? Did they simply fail to leave behind any other detectable evidence across such an enormous span of time? Both of these possibilities are difficult to rule out, but they are also difficult to prove. There is also the broader context of human migration that this claim has to somehow fit into. Genetic evidence from populations across the world, along with the fossil record from Africa, Europe, and Asia, has built up an increasingly detailed picture of when and how modern humans spread across the planet. That evidence generally places the major dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa within the last 100,000 years or so, with populations reaching different continents at different times based on migration routes, climate conditions, and sea levels. A confirmed human presence in North America at 130,000 years old does not fit cleanly into that picture. It would require either a species other than Homo sapiens making the journey, something for which there is currently zero direct fossil evidence anywhere in the Americas, or it would require rethinking major aspects of the broader migration story that have been built up from dozens of independent lines of evidence over many decades of research. This is precisely why so many archaeologists reacted with what might look, from the outside, like stubborn resistance, but is more accurately described as appropriate scientific caution. Extraordinary claims genuinely do require extraordinary evidence, and right now, more than 8 years after the original publication, the Cerutti Mastodon site still stands largely alone. No second site with a comparably ancient, comparably well-documented human signature has emerged anywhere else in North America to corroborate it. Comparable controversies exist elsewhere too. Footprints found preserved in ancient lakebed sediment at White Sands, New Mexico, have themselves generated intense debate over dating methods, with some researchers arguing for human presence over 20,000 years ago, itself a significant but far less radical revision compared to the numbers coming out of San Diego. That debate over White Sands has been argued back and forth in the scientific literature for years, and it illustrates that even much smaller adjustments to the accepted timeline face serious, sustained scrutiny before anything approaching consensus emerges. So where does that leave the story of the mastodon bones dug out of the ground in San Diego over 3 decades ago? It leaves it exactly where good, honest science often ends up, in a state of unresolved tension. The original research team has never backed down from their conclusion. They continue to stand by their dating, their experimental evidence, and their interpretation, and they point out that none of their critics have offered a fully satisfying alternative explanation that accounts for every piece of physical evidence at the site. Meanwhile, the broader archaeological community remains largely unconvinced, not necessarily because they think the researchers acted in bad faith or performed sloppy science, but because the implications of accepting this one site at face value are so enormous that the existing body of evidence, however carefully collected, still feels insufficient to support the weight of the conclusion being asked of it. What makes this story worth telling is not that it delivers a clean, satisfying answer, because it does not. What makes it worth telling is what it reveals about how fragile and contested our understanding of deep human history actually is, built not from certainty, but from an accumulation of evidence that gets challenged, tested, defended, and revised generation after generation. Every so often, a discovery comes along that forces the entire field to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the story we have been telling ourselves is incomplete? The Cerutti Mastodon site has been asking that question for years now, and nobody, not the original researchers, not their critics, not the broader scientific community, has been able to answer it with total confidence in either direction. It also helps to understand just how unusual it is for a paleontology project tied to a highway expansion to end up reshaping an entire academic debate. Most fossil salvage work never makes headlines. Crews recover a few bones, catalog them, hand them over to a museum, and life moves on. The fact that this particular stretch of California dirt happened to contain something this contested is part of what makes the story feel almost accidental, like history quietly hiding in plain sight under a road nobody thought twice about driving on. Richard Cerutti spent decades working construction sites across San Diego County looking for exactly this kind of find. And by most accounts, he never wavered in his conviction that what his team uncovered in 1992 was genuine evidence of ancient human activity, even as the debate around it grew louder and more contentious with each passing year. He continued defending the site publicly for the rest of his life, arguing that archaeologists who dismissed extraordinarily old claims outright were sometimes doing so less because of the physical evidence in front of them, and more because of how disruptive accepting that evidence would be to decades of established career-defining research. That tension between evidence and disruption is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something important about how scientific fields police themselves. Nobody wants to be the researcher who staked their reputation on a claim that later gets dismantled. That caution serves a real purpose, protecting the field from chasing sensational but ultimately hollow conclusions. But that same caution can also make it genuinely difficult for legitimate, boundary-pushing evidence to gain a fair hearing, especially when accepting it would mean unraveling a framework that took generations of careful, incremental work to build. Somewhere between reckless credulity and reflexive dismissal is where careful science is supposed to live, and the Cerutti Mastodon site has spent years testing exactly where that line should be drawn. It is also worth remembering that this would not be the first time an accepted archaeological timeline has been pushed backward after fierce initial resistance. The Clovis first model, the idea that no humans existed in the Americas before the 13,000-year-old stone tool culture, was itself treated as unquestionable dogma for much of the 20th century. Sites that challenged it were dismissed for years before mounting evidence eventually forced a grudging revision. That history does not prove the Cerutti site is correct, but it does mean the scientific community has been wrong about a supposedly settled timeline before, which is part of why this debate has never been allowed to simply fade away quietly, even among researchers who remain deeply skeptical of the specific date being proposed. Somewhere in the collection of the San Diego Natural History Museum, those broken bones and worn stones still sit, carefully preserved, waiting for either new evidence to emerge, a second site to be found, or a new dating technique to arrive that might finally settle the argument one way or another. Until that happens, the Cerutti Mastodon site remains exactly what it has been since the day Richard Cerutti first noticed something strange in the dirt back in 1992, one of the most tantalizing, most contested, and most unresolved puzzles in the entire story of how humans came to populate this continent. And maybe that is the most honest place to leave it, not with a triumphant declaration that history has been rewritten, and not with a dismissive shrug that the whole thing was a mistake, but with the simple, unsettling acknowledgement that we still do not fully know who, or what, was standing in that California riverbed 130,000 years ago, breaking open the bones of a mastodon.